Hey gang, so we're on to section 2.2, measuring a carbon footprint. So last video we looked at what is a carbon footprint, and now we're going to look at ways that you can measure your own carbon footprint. So what is your carbon footprint? And we talked about this last video, but I just figured I would quickly review it. Your secondary footprint measures the total greenhouse gas emissions for the food you eat and the products and services you buy and use every day. So this is a really important part of determining a carbon footprint. It's a little more difficult to figure out sometimes. It measures GHG, that's greenhouse gas emissions, over the entire life cycle of the products we use. These are called cradle-to-grave costs, and we did a cradle-to-grave activity last week. These costs start with the materials that go into manufacturing a product and end when the product is disposed of and starts to decompose. Almost everything you buy and use has a carbon price tag that adds to your carbon footprint. For example, when you buy a plastic bottle of water, the greenhouse gases that are released during its manufacture and transport to the store are added to your carbon footprint. Whether it's the cheeseburger you order, cheeseburgers, a drive-through window, or the amount of packaging on a new computer game you just bought, it all adds to your carbon footprint. The different choices you make as a consumer affect the size of your carbon footprint. For example, your carbon footprint will be smaller if you eat locally grown food, and we talked about going to farmers markets, rather than food that has been shipped from another country. This is because not as much fuel has been burnt to transport locally grown food to your table. This also applies to other products like clothing and furniture. So now we're going to take a look at vehicles. Your carbon footprint may be smaller or larger depending on what type of vehicle you drive and how fuel efficient it is. Some vehicles are more fuel efficient than others. Fuel efficiency is usually measured in the distance the vehicle can travel per unit volume of fuel it uses. So what that means is how much gas it took to go from Thunder Bay to Nipigon, or Thunder Bay to Toronto, or Thunder Bay to Winnipeg. In Canada, fuel efficiency is measured in liters of fuel the vehicle uses per 100 kilometers. Okay, so liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. The fewer liters of fuel a vehicle uses, the greater its fuel efficiency. So that's really important. So some vehicles might use, say, 10 liters per 100 kilometer, others may be 6.1, and some might be 15. Hybrid vehicles generally have greater fuel efficiency than conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. ICEVs move by burning fuel in a combustion engine. That's what burning means. A hybrid vehicle uses two or more different power sources to move. Many hybrid vehicles are hybrid electric vehicles. Hybrid electric vehicles combine an internal combustion engine and one or more electric motors. Table 2.1 compares the carbon footprint values of different kinds of ICEVs and HEVs. Each of the vehicles as listed is a 2007 model and has been driven for 40,000 kilometers. You will see that the HEVs have a smaller carbon footprint than the ICEVs. So let's take a look at this right now. So when we examine this, we can see a Toyota Prius only produces 4.63 tons of CO2 per 40,000 kilometers. So after 40,000 kilometers of driving, which may be a few years of driving, it produces 4.63 tons of CO2 equivalent. And most of that's going to be CO2. But if we look at a Ferrari, I love Ferraris. They are awesome. Holy moly, look at that. A 2007 Ferrari. My favorite, Testarossa Ferrari. That's what Dr. Dre got when he first made it. So after 40,000 kilometers for the Ferrari, you got 5 times the amount of carbon dioxide equivalents. So yeah, that's way more, like 5 times. That's a crazy more amount. Now, fast car, fun car, love that car, but not super good for the environment. And what we could do with this, if say we said, well, what if the car was driven for 120,000 kilometers? 120,000 is 3 times larger, is 40,000 times 3. So if I wanted to figure out the total carbon footprint after 120,000 kilometers, I would take each of these and multiply them by 3. And that would be the carbon footprint after 120,000 kilometers. One of the reasons HEVs have a smaller carbon footprint is that their electric batteries can store and reuse energy in stop-and-go traffic. So this is the mechanics of how it works. That's really important. When we explain things, we have to give some specific details here. Still, HEVs do have negative environmental impacts. For example, their nickel-based batteries are toxic. Ooh, so this is a specific detail about how they still have an environmental footprint. However, they are less toxic than the lead-based batteries that are used in most other vehicles, so that is a good thing. They're less toxic. Your carbon footprint for driving a vehicle all year long is often not much bigger than the footprint for taking just a few plane trips a year. I'm not sure how many of you hop on a plane regularly, probably not a lot of you, but business people fly on planes and things like that all the time. Some people fly to visit family. If you fly on a plane in a business class versus economy, your carbon footprint will be larger because you're taking up more space on the plane. So that's really interesting. That if you take up more space on the plane, you have a larger carbon footprint. And a lot of people feel like they're sandwiched like sardines in the planes, and I've been on planes where everyone's all tight together and it's not a lot of fun, and people want to pay the extra money so they've got a little more leg space, but you're creating a bigger carbon footprint. Your footprint is also larger if your plane flies at a high altitude in the sky, because more fuel is being used than if the plane flies at a lower altitude. The larger the plane and the further it has to travel, the higher it will fly in the sky. So the big jets and that. So the ones coming out of Thunder Bay are the smaller airplanes. They fly a little bit lower. But if you're going, say, from Toronto or Vancouver around the world, you're going to fly on a much bigger airplane. Rich countries make large footprints. All right, so now we're going to compare sort of Canada to other countries in the world and see how we compare. The size of your carbon footprint can be large or small depending on where you live. In rich developed countries like Canada, many of us who have enough money to buy big houses and 1 or more cars, we also fly more often and buy more of everything. In poor developing countries in Asia, Africa, and South America, people earn much less money. It is rare for people to own a car or a large house. Rich, developed countries make up a small percentage of the world population, yet they're responsible, this is huge, they're responsible for 7 out of every 10 tons of CO2 that have been released into the air since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So countries like Canada, the United States, the UK, we only have a small percentage of the world population, but we produce almost all of the CO2 that's been going into the atmosphere. These emissions have led to today's climate change. Some developing countries like India are now producing more emissions, so that's something that we need to be aware of. However, carbon footprints for people in developed countries are still much larger than footprints for people in developing countries. So an example of this would be a child by the age of 2 years old in the U.S. A child by the age of 2 in the U.S. produces more CO2 by just living and all the things that the parents buy for them and stuff. I don't mean what they breathe out. I mean all the things that go into the diapers and the home and the food and all that stuff, formula. They will have a greater carbon footprint than someone living in Africa who's lived to the age of 70 years old, which is crazy. So a 2-year-old in the U.S. has got a greater carbon footprint than a 70-year-old in Africa on average. And just to put in a perspective, National Geographic did a study, and they created a video called The Human Footprint. Really good. We're going to be checking it out with this class. They calculated that the amount of cans of pop that the average person goes through is over 37,000 cans. And those cans are made up of aluminum, and aluminum needs to be mined out of the ground. Now, we can recycle aluminum, but the vast majority of aluminum cans aren't recycled properly still. So that gives you a bit of an idea about the carbon footprint. The world's poorest people make the smallest carbon footprints. The United Nations estimates that the carbon footprint of the poorest 1 billion people on Earth is around 3% of the planet's total footprint. These people have contributed the least to global warming. Yet, because they live in poor rural areas and city slums, they are the most affected by the negative effects of climate change. For example, they suffer through droughts and floods, which can cause the crops and which can affect their crops and drinking water. This in turn affects their health. It also affects how much money they make, which affects whether or not they can afford to buy clothes and food or go to school. So I understand that there's varying levels of poverty, but there are a lot of really poor people in the world. If we take a look at the share of global CO2 emissions, we can see that that the U.S. has got the greatest share of CO2. It's way higher than everyone else. Now, we might be looking at Canada and say, look at us, we haven't produced that much. If you actually compare the per capita amount of CO2 produced by people in the United States and Canada, Canadians produce per capita, which means per person, more CO2. So Canadian individuals have a greater carbon footprint than Americans. Now, there's a reason for this, because we have cold winters in Canada, so we need to heat our homes, which means we're going to burn a lot of natural gas or heat our homes with electricity, which usually now requires burning natural gas or hydroelectricity. And then we still have summers where we need to use air conditioning, whereas the U.S. isn't nearly as cold, so they don't burn nearly as much. And our standard of living is very comparable to the Americans. So yeah, so Canada maybe in total is not producing a lot of CO2, but Canadians on average produce just as much, if not more, than Americans on average. So here's the big thing. This is the most important thing right here. Reducing your carbon footprints. So there are different ways people can reduce their carbon footprints by cutting down their greenhouse gas emissions. Some examples of the seemingly small things you can do every day include, and here's what we got: driving less or taking public transit, cutting down trash by recycling as well as composting organic waste, buying locally grown food and drinking local water, reducing your consumption of meat and dairy products. High greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock farming and from the heavy use of fertilizers, some of which break down in the powerful global warming gas as nitric oxide, using a microwave rather than a conventional oven and stove, which uses more energy. So these are all a whole bunch of things that we can do, and I'm not going to go through them all, but as you go through this list, you can see that there's a whole bunch of things that we can do to reduce our carbon footprint. People can also choose to become carbon neutral. Becoming carbon neutral means taking responsibility for the greenhouse gas emissions we create by buying carbon offsets. Carbon offsets are emission reduction credits that people buy to make up for the greenhouse gases they put in the air. If you add greenhouse gases to the air, you can buy carbon offsets to financially support projects that result in fewer greenhouse gases in the air. So it's kind of like planting trees, right? For every dollar you spend at the movie theater, you plant X number of trees, right? For every you can do this now buying airplane tickets in a lot of cases. Is if you buy an airplane ticket, you can pay extra money, which will then go into projects where they try and reduce carbon footprints. And a lot of those projects do things like simply like planting trees, because trees will pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Like carbon footprints, carbon offsets are measured in tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. Carbon offsets can be bought to support local and international projects. Examples of carbon offsets projects include tree planting projects to limit deforestation. They also include renewable energy projects to develop wind and solar energy. You will learn more about renewable and non-renewable energy sources in Chapter 4. Governments can make even more of a difference to carbon footprints by making laws to reduce or get rid of fossil fuels for industrial use. For example, coal-fired electricity is one of Ontario's largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. In 2006, the Ontario government demolished the coal-fired Lakeview Generating Station in Mississauga. By the end of 2014, Ontario will stop burning coal at its remaining 4 coal-fired generating stations, and we have stopped burning coal. All right, gang, so go through and do the activity, and we're going to be getting you to do a small activity where you're actually comparing your carbon footprint if you were to drive from Thunder Bay to Toronto or fly from Thunder Bay to Toronto. And we're going to be focusing on this over the next few weeks and doing like little audits in your house and things like that, just to see, start to understand more of what your carbon footprint is.